In addition to your bill, which will become an act of this Wizengamot shortly, the Mugwump continued, addressing Black. We also endorse the declaration of any Mole who is deemed by a wizard to be at risk of undermining our world as Mistborn. Cecilia sat up sharply and looked at the Inquisitor wizards who were nodding amongst themselves. So they weren't protesting the proposal by Joseph Black but supporting him. Upon this declaration, any wizard or creature under oath to a wizard may destroy the Mole. A wizard who has exterminated one on the basis of knowing they are Mistborn shall be exempt from prosecution. Cura in Potentia. The wizard sitting next to Honoria Black got to his feet and shouted the words to the Inquisitors, the Mugwump and Joseph Black in a thick French accent. Cura in Potentia. Power upon bloodshed. No, thought Cecilia in horror. It can't have begun that way. Surely there must have been some show of resistance to it all. Those wizards can't have just sat there and merrily waved it all through. Well spoke, that man. The Mugwump smiled and waved back at Malfoy. Power amongst bloodshed, eh? Perhaps that should become your family motto, Black? Perhaps, replied Malfoy, in his thick accent. They already engaged the services of a Mr. Ludd. Have you not, Mr. Black? Indeed, replied Joseph Black. Mugwump, under the orders of my soon-to-be son-in-law the aforementioned gentleman has been well furnished with gold to resist the advances of the science and technology of moles. Ludd? As in the Luddites? Mole history told a different tale, of workers destroying machines because it had made them, as skilled workers, unemployed, starving them into action. Excellent. The Prime Inquisitor beamed approvingly at Black. Good work, Joseph. I mentioned to the fellows of your previous success. The King of Great Britain is now considered by those around him to be mad. A physician was summoned when he told his eldest son he had been talking to little wizards in the fireplace. Only Honoria Black sat stiffly and did not acknowledge the Prime Inquisitor's assertion. The rest of the wizards, the 11 in the benches, the Mugwump, Black and Malfoy all laughed in support, and presumably at the fate of King George. Cecilia shook her head in disbelief. Those wizards speaking like that. How dare they? How could they? When all that separated Joseph Black and the rest of them over there and her over here was a random selection of proteins assembled in a certain sequence, allowing them to metabolize energy in a different way. A difference that had worked to her advantage by allowing her to pass unharmed beyond the veil. If we are quite finished, I would like to attend a function now, said the Mugwump, disapparating and then reapparating in front of Joseph Black. He held out a hand. Bravery, Black. Our children and our children's children will thank us, you know. It's not true. It won't turn out like that. Cecilia heard herself shouting in vain. Moles, many moles will die, as will wizards when you pass this. And your recruitment program for the Force. The Mugwump took Joseph Black's shoulder and headed towards the door. Cecilia began to move after them, resolving not to miss any of the conversation. Excellently. We need only to eliminate those who stand in our way. Watts Associates. Priestley, Bolton, Wedgwood, Darwin to start. Others who question our authority. The unfortunate incident with the village in Derbyshire was entirely coincidental, but it does show how effective out methods are, as well as leaving behind very little evidence. All magic. What? Cecilia knew her protestations were hopeless. They could not hear her in the memory, but the anger at their casual severing of mole wizard ties and the persecution of moles who opposed them had rankled with her. It was almost as if she had witnessed the birth of the Death Eaters as the two wizards spoke. The Mugwump tapped the side of his nose knowingly, and Cecilia felt the urge to pull him back by the shoulder and thump him. Do you know how much damage you're doing? Cecilia yelled at their retreating backs as the wizards made their way towards the door of the Wizengamot. What you've started, Voldemort continued. You could have just talked to your daughter, there was no need for this. Both wizards turned round, glancing at one another briefly. You've condemned your ancestors to a life of struggle and strife. There'll be wizard deaths. There'll be riots. She watched wide-eyed but defiant as Joseph Black walked towards her. What did you say? Cecilia glanced behind her but could not see who Joseph Black was speaking to. You're so wrong, she muttered. But instead of stepping past her and talking to someone else, Joseph Black took a few more steps towards her, looking at her quizzically. I said, what did you say? Now I ask, who are you? There was no mistaking it. Joseph Black was speaking to her. It doesn't matter. The mugwump who had accompanied Black across the floor stood next to him. Time in custody will explain why such a witch as this, in such a bizarre mode of dress, is present in the Wizengamot. Who let you in? Was it her? Joseph Black pointed past Cecilia and she turned, taking in Honoria Black's dejected expression, and a spark of anger passed through her. Speak, woman, or by Merlin the mugwump can take you off to loosen your tongue. And you think your descendants will be proud of you? Replied Cecilia hotly. Because of what you've done tonight you've caused them more harm, distress, upset than ever you can imagine. She shook her head in annoyance as Joseph Black made to grab her arm, but Cecilia stepped away. Where did you come from? He demanded as Honoria Black walked past her father and the mugwump, making for the door. A long way from here, replied Cecilia, her heart jumping in her chest. How could she be interacting with the people here? These were memories. She was a mere visitor. But you're not a wizard. The mugwump narrowed his bulging dark eyes as he analyzed her. No, she replied. She was in a memory. As such she wasn't really here. She could transcend the memory, and that's exactly what she must do. Fast. Then you're a mole. Tell me, mole, how can you be standing here? Take me to your leader, Cecilia managed, cringing inside at the cliché. Let me come with you to somewhere more convivial and I'll tell you everything. At first it looked as if Joseph Black was about to argue, but he made the mistake of glancing at the mugwump, who shrugged whilst continuing to stare at Cecilia. Go to your party, Torpin. I'll deal with this. To her amazement the mugwump shrugged again and turned, following the 12 inquisitors out of the door to the Wizengamot. Once the door boomed shut, Joseph Black turned to Cecilia again. Of course, mole. Cecilia glanced at Black as he gestured towards the back of the Wizengamot, his voice in familiar honeyed tones. Tell me all you can and I promise you that you will return safely to wherever you came. Cecilia ran towards the doors which she had seen the mugwump and inquisitors had passed moments before. Behind her, the shock of her abscondment stalled him for a moment, though it was just for a moment. Cecilia knew from the thumps on the floor that he was running too, and gazing. Her only hope was to make it through the doors or to wherever the outer limits of the memory was. Stop! Joseph Black screamed the demand towards her. You are a spy. Moles are weakening the powers of wizards. The doors were closer now. Around her a bolt of purple light whooshed past her, narrowly missing her right hand. Cecilia felt the heat of the spell across the back of her hand. She could feel here. And if she could feel, then she almost certainly could die. Suddenly the enormity of her task behind the veil took on a whole new meaning. Moles are parasites. Behind her Joseph Black was gaining. Cecilia saw the wizard in hot pursuit. She turned to face the way she was going, towards the doorway and beyond. She had to get there, she must. She must get out. You are Mistborn. Cecilia got to the door, resisting the urge to turn and shout back something scathing to Joseph Black, who clearly thought he had said something clever. She flung open the door and looked for the pillow-like folds of the memory. I'll get you, Mistborn Mel. Below her an empty nothingness. She could see neither the interface between the memory and its outer shell nor other memory clouds, tethered together or otherwise. Behind her one irate wizard. There was nothing she could do as the echoing footsteps of her pursuer grew louder and louder. and then she saw it. Her weight was making what she was standing on vibrate. There was another dot almost invisible to the eye and blending in with the charcoal grey ether. Mull. Perhaps she could jump to the next one. The near invisible memory was moving. If she timed it right. You will talk. Joseph Black, the 60-odd-year-old wizard who had just enacted the greatest division between moles and wizards since the dawn of settled civilization, made a grab for Cecilia's arm. Closing her eyes, she leapt. A whoosh beside her and the memory that had been before her slipped past. She screamed, waving her arms round frantically. Nowhere there was nothing was going to be good. Cecilia closed her eyes. She still had a few strands of the passing memory and seemed to be holding it steady, but, writhing with the other hand, the grip of Sirius's ancestor was too much and she had to let go. Joseph Black laughed. You are going to wish you had never sought us, Mull, he said, pulling out his wand as he hung Cecilia out with one arm over the edge of the memory, raising it malevolently. I am going to dash. But whatever he was going to do was lost within a roar as Cecilia's foot landed in the soft stomach of the wizard. She fell, but not without taking a handful of the memory from which she was falling in her grasp. Plunging through memories again, Cecilia's mind fixed on one thing as a diminishing figure hopped around in fury. She could alter memories. When she found the Horcrux she could destroy it. 88,888,888. From the swirling fog and mist 2 wizards appeared and a hush descended in the chamber. Slowly emerging from the dimness, the wizards from all sides watched as Lucius Malfoy and Albus Dumbledore were revealed to them. The effect was as if to bring a fuzzy picture into focus using a camera lens, and the factions paused in their own conflict and watched in various states of awe, horror or anticipation as the mighty sorcerers displayed their might before them. Whispers between the wizards now sprang up as Dumbledore directed the Death Eater into the path of the others. His shots weak and his aim inaccurate. When the Death Eaters noticed this, a murmur of contempt began, spurring on Malfoy to drive Dumbledore back towards the errors and order, who were now essentially one. Voldemort sends a follower to fight me, shouted Dumbledore, stepping slowly backwards under the rain of high-energy curses falling towards him like shooting stars, for he fears to face the truth. His voice rang out through the chamber as the Death Eater drove him back. He has too much fear. But it was patently obvious to those watching the duel that he was losing. The head of the Order of the Phoenix forged a furrow in the group, driven back by the might of Lucius Malfoy. From their ranks murmurs of uncertainty began to grow and, complementing this, laughter as the Death Eaters uttered their own undisguised contempt. The new world will be in his hands, hissed Malfoy as Dumbledore caused the Order to separate into 2 groups around them. And he needs moles to keep the cogs turning. I can't deny Dumbledore that they have their place, scurrying around like rats, present company accepted, he added, shooting a look at Wormtail's body behind him. And then he stopped advancing. This was mainly due to the fact that Dumbledore had stopped retreating. Other wizards, those from the Order and a couple of Aurors behind them, flanked the wizard on both sides, wand arms raised. Their wood pointed towards Lucius Malfoy. The Death Eater dropped his arm lazily and sneered, glancing around at the Order wizards. And now your company is assembled, Dumbledore. I will have great pleasure in reducing your power to nothing in readiness for the Dark Lord himself. We shall watch you die. Every single one of you. Behind him a couple of the taller, stockier Death Eaters guffawed horribly, the noise echoing around the chamber, back and forth between the 2 enclosed walls between which the wizards were standing, several of them back to back defending the area territorially. Or, you will hand over the mole, and you have the Dark Lord's word that the wizards assembled here and the children. He strained towards the back of the group where Harry and the others were standing. Several of the Order firmly in front of them will go free, so that you may provide him with at least a bit of a challenge. Mrs. Frobisher is not here, replied Dumbledore evenly. I believe you are in receipt of the Daily Prophet, Lucius. Mrs. Frobisher was murdered by Dementors on the information of an underage wizard, but Malfoy shook his head as a clatter and clash behind them caused many of the wizards to stare at the intrusion. Mrs. Frobisher's alive. Idiots! Shouted Bill Weasley as his twin brothers stumbled into the chamber. Fred and George looked around at those assembled, waiting for the news to be greeted with acclaim. Instead the Order were staring at them angrily while the Death Eaters hissed at the now obvious lie that Dumbledore had clearly just told. "She is here," concluded Lucius Malfoy, nodding with satisfaction as the twins were ushered towards the back of the Order to scoldings from both of their parents, though I must admit that I had it on good authority before those two arrived. "You have a traitor in your midst, Dumbledore." "Prove it." The shout came from the back of the Order, and between a ripple of wizards moving out of the way, Harry moved towards Malfoy, standing next to Dumbledore, his wand aloft. "Harry," murmured Dumbledore warningly, but the young wizard ignored him. "Prove it," he repeated, his tone firm and his wand aloft. "I want to know who you think is a traitor, Mr. Malfoy." "Ooh!" called a female voice from behind Lucius Malfoy. "Proper polite, and everything." Bellatrix took a few steps towards them, pausing at her brother-in-law's right-hand side. "Why don't we prove it, brother?" She scanned the wizards before her, each of them eyeing her back with equal contempt as if proposing a suitable candidate. From Tabitha's position, stooping as she was near the body of Wormtail with Snape near the arch, the scene looked not dissimilar to piranhas toying with their prey. "Yes," nodded Harry, turning to glance at the Order. "Traitor! Step forward and show yourself." Amongst the Order a ripple of communication occurred, traveling like a wave over a calm ocean. Some jostling near the back made Harry hold his breath, but, as he watched, none of the 24 Order came forth to claim the title. He glanced at Dumbledore before looking back to Malfoy. As he did so, a figure pushed past him and walked on, positioning themselves between Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange. A cackling filled the chamber, born from a single source. Bellatrix had thrown her head back in delight as the ripple of noise became sharper and more discordious. "Shall I reveal to the poor fools in front of us what it was that you promised the Dark Lord?" Malfoy turned to the traitor at his side. Sirius Black shook his head, refusing to make eye contact with his godson as Harry stared at him in disbelief. "I will." He stared past the Order, as if he was talking to a spot on the wall behind them. If any of the wizards before him had anything to say about Sirius's betrayal, they were too dumbstruck to voice it. Instead, Sirius's words were what bathed all present momentarily as he described the deal between himself and Voldemort. "So you see, I had to let Cecilia Frobisher do this, for I cannot or rather, I cannot and live." He looked at Dumbledore momentarily before glancing across to his godson. "It was for you, Harry, and only you. I will bring back your parents and you can live in peace." "No!" screamed Harry, his emotions overriding his coolness and collectiveness as the realization that his father figure had been standing in front of them all, revealing dreadful deeds and motives. You can't have done. You cannot have been with them." "Oh, but he has, you see." Lucius Malfoy's honeyed voice oozed around the chamber. "Ever since Dumbledore told you about the prophecies. The Dark Lord surmised there was a way back." "Through my brother," confirmed Sirius. "You see, Dumbledore," Malfoy continued. "Blood is thicker than water. Sirius has merely clung on to what he holds most dear, that of his family. You underestimated what loneliness would do. The soul of our Lord can be pieced together thanks to pertinent and vital information in the way it couldn't last time, and ironically, the Mole is going to do it for us." In front of the two Death Eaters and their newly revealed accomplice, outrage and fury was shouted and screamed in no uncertain terms. "You sent her to her death, for nothing, Sirius?" Harry's voice rose above the rest and pierced the air, his sentiment summing up exactly what each and every wizard in the Order was feeling. "Not for nothing," Harry, Sirius sighed, like a child not explaining to a parent well enough the reason for their minor misdemeanor. For you. To rid you of the curse that has been with you since birth. Her death will be nothing. For the boy who lived. For my friends who are to be resurrected. For my cousin. So she can remarry. No. Nymphadora Tonks pushed past Dumbledore and stood, fists on hips, in front of her cousin. Her hatred for the other two of her family was clear in her stance, and she stared at Sirius with a look of disbelief and fury. No. Tonks's voice dropped low and she focused her gaze on her cousin. Don't tell me that. You don't mean to say. The grin on Sirius Black's face and the offhand nod was enough to say, well, actually yes. I did it for you, Dora. He turned sharply and looked at his aunt and uncle. Bellatrix, it's gone now, hasn't it? Delight played on the face of the witch as further realization caused Tonks's face to crumple. Sirius in turn grinned heartily. The werewolf? She nodded swiftly at Sirius. It was a good job my dear brother-in-law here was wearing dragon skin under his robe the night it bit. Bellatrix placed a delicate hand on Lucius Malfoy's shoulder and the wizard nodded in agreement, but nevertheless. It bit. And now it is. Exterminated. She took her hand and placed it onto her nephew's shoulder. Dear Sirius. She mused, always pretending family didn't matter. Evening, Bella, Sirius replied. Killed many moles tonight? Not as many as you by the sounds of it. She nodded her head towards the veil. Yet. Why? Harry screamed his protest at his godfather, the one person who he thought he could rely on for anything. Sirius, why? For him. My family. To save his family, what little I have left of it. This time Sirius's cool demeanor about his defection was replaced with frustration, leaked out through high pressure. Tonks was supposed to marry Lupin, not a pathetic mole. But now Remus is free of this world, free of this humiliation. He will live again without the indignity of his condition, free of her, and you, Harry, will be free too. He stooped a little to Harry's height and proffered a comforting hand towards him. Harry raised his wand defensively. All you need to do is to take the potion, Harry, and all this. Everything you've ever dreamed of will be true. Turning quickly, Sirius made a run in the direction of the archway. The Order and Death Eaters watched as he neared, grinning and leering towards it with glee. From his position behind it, Severus Snape made a leap, like a cat, bringing the treacherous wizard to the floor, just missing Mad-Eye Moody, who clearly had the same idea. Instead, the elderly wizard continued his trajectory towards the archway and stared down, at the fluttering veil. Behind them the Order leaned towards the arch too, peering in their direction. Can you see her, Mad-Eye? Arthur Weasley called out from the back of the crowd. Is she really down there? There's a rope, called back Moody. And clouds. Is she down there? Repeated Snape, his gruff words made difficult by the struggling of his former adversary underneath him. She is. But I cannot see her. There are limits even to my genius, Snape. But the wizard was not listening. Snape had turned his attention to Sirius, who he had now let go, holding into only by the ankles. Sirius, you were supposed to go. Snape spoke his words loudly and firmly so that the revelation was not lost to those around them. Your deal, at Christmas time, with Dumbledore. Sirius struggled to turn and look at Snape. From Tabitha's vantage point it looked as if he was trying to wriggle free. I couldn't lose her again. As one, Order, Death Eaters, Aurors, Mysterias and children stared at Sirius Black. What was he saying? What did he mean? It seemed that Snape knew, and he continued with the conversation. You kept her. Everyone believed she is dead, but I kept her, Snape, just as you say. I knew I needed her, and not just for the veil. He watched his former adversary raise his wand in a familiar gesture, following the tip with his eyes. Behind him Lucius Malfoy snorted at the scene as their former ally stepped towards their newest. Just as Tabitha, the Death Eaters and the Order and even Snape himself thought that he was about to attack Sirius Black, Dumbledore moved. It was almost unnoticed to those further away from them that he extended his hand and looked between the two wizards' advance. Severus. He's not one of them. He moved his hand towards Snape's intended victim and looked at the wizard. Sirius. Rejoin us. Slowly, Sirius Black turned to look back at Dumbledore. He was the wizard who had been his headmaster, who had vouched for him at his trial and who was now simultaneously his leader and his enemy. And then time let its guard down and allowed its relativistic nature to be revealed to anyone who cared to look. Relativity, so Einstein once explained, was what made spending an hour with a beautiful woman feel like a minute and what made sitting on a hot stove for a minute feel like an hour. It was the latter analogy which was pertinent to the situation now. The scene played out seemed slow-moving and lethargic, as if it was taking hours. Sirius took a lazy look at Snape before making a move towards Dumbledore. At the same time Malfoy raised his wand, replacing Snape as the aggressor. Behind Dumbledore and Sirius the Order angled their wands and behind Malfoy the Death Eaters lifted both wands and guns. In reality though the outbreak of the heart of the battle took mere seconds. Ceasefire seceded out and out battle as both sides of wizards launched attacks simultaneously. The best of both factions pitted against one another. At the back of the Order's number no longer were the children being shielded from the battle as everything it had was concentrated on challenging the enemy. Come on. Fred and George were harried by Harry, who had returned to the back of the Order into joining them, as they too fought the Death Eaters. The twins looked at one another for a split second as if they hadn't heard their brother's friend but soon stepped side by side of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who were further forward at the right-hand side of the group, leaving Neville and Luna to defend from the left at the rear. "You take this end?" cried Harry as he deflected a couple of bullets from an inept Death Eater who had foolishly chosen to angle the barrel of his gun towards the ceiling. To his right, Ron glanced at him worriedly, exchanging glances with Hermione. "Where are you going?" he called. Snape. Before them, the ex-Death Eater, Potions Master and Covert Order member seemed to be losing a small battle in which he was engaged between two Death Eaters. He looked to be speaking to them but from the children's position about what Harry could not hear. "He can handle it," shouted back Hermione. "We need you here." "And I need the potion," Harry shouted back. "Otherwise we'll just be at stalemate." "You won't take it." A voice in Harry's head appeared as if he had thought it himself. He shook it away, defending his transcendence across the dark, hard floor. Next to his Potions Master he fought shoulder to shoulder, his effort contributing to the decline of the second Death Eater who had had the misfortune to challenge Snape to a duel wand-to-gun. "And what can I do for you, Potter?" From his lips the words curled pungently as he lay in a few good blows to the defeated Death Eater, who sank to his knees before him. "The potion. Please, Professor. Can you give it to me now?" Without questioning, without biting bitterness or caustic sarcasm, Snape reached into his robe with his left hand and within seconds the wizard had extracted two small, Gothic-shaped vials. "Take care, Harry," he replied as he gave the vials over to Harry, pressing them deep into his hand. "These are all I have. Good luck." Seconds later, Snape had turned stiffly from Harry and was fighting his third Death Eater, deftly aiming spells to disarm his adversary. Harry turned, pocketing the match and base potions in his trouser pocket before withdrawing to the area in which his friends were fighting. A Death Eater lay before them, seemingly unconscious. "Congratulations," commented Harry approvingly. "How did you manage that?" "The idiot kept on shouting how guns were going to kill us all," Fred replied, his voice light with mirth. "But then he turned it round and pointed it at himself." George gestured towards his wand towards the Death Eater's head. shot off his own ear. Then Hermione immobilized him, added Ron, grinning in his friend's direction. Well, let's hope they're all that stupid. I don't think Bellatrix Lestrange or Draco's father are going to be that easy to defeat. No, indeed, commented Hermione, looking towards the center of the battle as Dumbledore had once again taken up wand against Lucius Malfoy, who had himself seemingly shunned the idea of mulligans. Got the potion? Asked Ron as a group of Death Eaters looked in their direction. Here. Harry tapped his pocket. Well, you'd better take it, continued Ron, eyeing the approaching wizards. Voldemort'll be here soon. Harry looked at his friend, about to agree with him and reach for the base potion vial, but he hesitated, shaking his head. Why? Asked Ron, leveling his wand. Harry did so too and stood between him and Hermione. Not yet. It's only when Mrs. Frobisher's done what Sirius sent her to do that he'll return to full power. If I take it too soon, he'll be here. It'll be like a trigger. He cast a wordless Expelliarmus spell in the direction of the two short Death Eaters, who dodged it easily. Yes, replied Hermione. He'll be here. He'll be whole. You'll be able to defeat him. Voldemort will never win. Dumbledore shook his head in the direction of Snape while he continued to fight Lucius Malfoy as the wizard attempted to engage the Death Eater with the head of the Order of the Phoenix. Whether it was to do with his damaged wand or if instead he meant to glance in the direction of the archway and to where a figure upon whom another Death Eater was advancing, Snape was not sure. He decided to pursue the latter. If you say so. The ex-Death Eater heard Malfoy laugh as he retreated, ducking low as a round of volley fire from a second Death Eater break up some of the mysteries in the first corridor. A flock of bats erupted from one and from another, a casket, black liquid oozed. Had he, or any of the Order noticed, he, or indeed they, would have seen that some of the Death Eaters appeared to be discarding their weapons, those not engaging in on the front line, with the slowly diminishing number of Order members disappearing too. Had they, or he, looked longer, they would have seen that they had appeared in the antechamber, the corridor through which Tabitha had once taken the wizard to show him the arch, the main way from her office to the Vale and in which most of the mysteries were stored. Snape did, however, move past Sirius Black, taking the opportunity to stupefy him mildly as he went. Snape. He was on our side. I know, Moody. Duck. In response to the bearing down of one of the Death Eaters who had not vanished, she began to shuffle back towards the archway as the wizard concentrated not on her but on destroying the mysteries on the shelves behind her. No. Tabitha shrieked. Not the mysteries. By the time Snape had made his way over to Tabitha, he found her balled up to one side of the archway. In a manner unprecedented, Snape reached down her arm and extracted her hand, which she unresistingly gave him. The rest of the ball of which uncurled, and Snape was a little taken aback to see the distress on her face. What, Miss Penright? His voice was soft and steady, compelling Tabitha to no longer keep the secret that she had fought to conceal from him since she had brought him into the room of artifacts. The mysteries, she sighed. I am broken. Because they are gone, I am useless. Yes, you are, aren't you? Asked Snape, his tone contrasting with his choice of words. Now take me to the Mysteria who solved the Veil. Tabitha smiled at him, confidence welling in her stomach as she felt something strange happen. She felt energized, as if her body was filling with electricity. But all her mind had gone blank as around them, the prophecies in the far-off corridor fell to the floor, Death Eaters destroying them in whatever way they could. But to her ears the destruction sounded like beautiful music as Snape reached up and stroked her hair. Drew her to her knees as he knelt to her level. Pulled her towards him. Kissed her. He broke off as suddenly as he had started, and shocked Tabitha smiled back at him. Rest, he murmured as he leaned her against the back of one of the archway. I have no doubt you will know what to do very soon. From the floor Tabitha took her own wand, still embarrassingly fresh, looking for something which was 18 years old, and replaced the one in Snape's hand with it. "Go," she urged. "Do your duty." Moments later, Snape was using the surprisingly dynamic wand to defend the students who seemed to have already had a rough time of it in the face of the Carrows, who had, it seemed, injured Hermione and were dividing the small group into ever smaller ones. "Mr. Potter, you should now be considering taking that potion." With ease Snape drove back the Death Eaters towards the original area in which the original Death Eater groups had stood, allowing Harry the opportunity to assist. "I know. But right now, Professor, it doesn't seem quite the right time." Snape drove the Carrows further back, immobilizing Alecto and bearing down on Amycus. As they passed by the veil, Harry stopped, turning to face the flickering ragged material. "Potter, come away." "Where are you, Mrs. Frobisher?" The veil flicked beguilingly, hypnotically. The noises from behind it seemed to be telling him something, but what was it? "Harry." The shrill voice of Mrs. Weasley penetrated to Harry's consciousness, but he remained fixed to the spot, standing still with his hands to one side. He closed his eyes. "Harry Potter." Just as his name appeared as a voice in his mind, an explosion behind him made Harry turn suddenly, and he watched as the golden cloud of debris and energy coalesced into the Dark Lord. Voldemort. 88,888,888. Down. Through endless memories Cecilia fell. Around her the ghosts of events that had long since come to pass sped past her like advertising posters on an underground tunnel. Cecilia didn't know how long it had taken for her falling to feel like nothing, but when she realized that images were not passing before her eyes, she looked around. Nothingness still surrounded her as she looked from right to left, and it was only when she raised her left hand that she realized from the stolen strands of her last memory a tendril had sprung a shoot, attaching itself to no less than 2 memories. She was no longer falling. She was attached to memories. Under her grip the tendril felt firm, and tentatively Cecilia pulled upon it. It didn't give way. Far from it. Unlike the stem which had betrayed her at the start, this seemed firm and secure, and she pulled herself along it as the tendons of her upper left began to pull tortuously. She mustn't let go. This Cecilia knew, not to the strands, and she gritted her teeth as her shoulders bore her body weight until she was able to pull herself up onto the memory. And then she loosed the chunk of memory cloud that she had torn from the memory of Joseph Black and the Wizengamot, which flew from her hand into the space and was immediately surrounded by several other clouds, each attached to others. They jostled with one another, some floating away and some pressing on, as if a proto-consciousness within each one was determining the value of attaching to the small memory that Cecilia had held. Cecilia lay back and looked above her. As far up as she could see, and as far as she could determine that way was up, there seemed to be a small dot of light. Could this be the veil, she wondered? Could that be the way back to her world, and the people she knew? But she hadn't completed what she promised to do. There was no point speculating about whether that was the way home until she had found the Horcrux and destroyed it. Surely it was only a matter of trial and error. If she could find a memory of Sirius, she could probably find another where he was communicating with his brother. And once she had found Regulus, she would be able to find it. The part of Voldemort's soul that Regulus had abducted and put beyond detection. She must destroy it. Ignoring the muscular ache in her shoulders, Cecilia turned over and felt the memory with her hands. She might as well start somewhere, and this one was as good a memory cloud as any other. Soft, like the first 2 she had encountered, the memory had the texture of warm candy floss. She stuck in her head. And was surprised to see a wizard kneeling on the rug in front of a fireplace, his head stuck right in the hearth. Cecilia was even more surprised to see someone she knew. Sirius Black was talking to the back of the fireplace, but to whom he was addressing Cecilia couldn't be sure. She moved slowly towards Sirius, looking at him and waiting for him to turn round. But he didn't. Instead he continued to talk to the hearth. I walk through this funny little world of yours and I don't notice it. Not many wizards do. We're too strong. But you make me weak. Cecilia stopped in her progress towards him, struck by the tenderness of his words. Who was he speaking to? And were they replying? Before she could speculate or even wait to see what happened next, Cecilia felt herself jerk to the right and she began to move, just like she had done from the first memory. The scene dimmed and faded and Cecilia felt as if she was rushing sideways towards an unknown destination. She had barely enough time to gather her senses when the atmosphere of this memory made her freeze and look around her. Rain was pouring all around her, or so it seemed, and terror began to well in Cecilia's stomach as a storm blew open a window behind her and a crack of lightning illuminated the room. In the far corner a bed, and in the bed a person. Cecilia stared back at the person and she realized that it was a child, pajama-clad and staring right back at her. She made to speak but no sound came out except for a brief whimper as another crack of lightning punctuated the pouring of the rain. Why you? The child began to near Cecilia and as it approached she could see it was a boy of only about 7 or 8 who was wandering towards her holding a book. Me? Cecilia managed, stooping automatically to the boy's height, but he continued to stare in the spot where Cecilia had been standing. He wasn't looking at her but someone behind her. Something. For when Cecilia turned she looked into the face of something she recognized. She opened her mouth to scream and run but neither of these things happened. The werewolf stepped to one side and narrowed its red eyes. You, the boy repeated. You've come for the book. But you shan't have it. And then Cecilia recognized where she was. Remus had taken her back through his memories several times to when he and his family lived in a house not far from Oxford. She recognized the room. Fair-haired boy. Book. Werewolf. Pieces of the jigsaw began to fall into place. Remus. Cecilia screamed at the boy. Give him the book. It won't mean anything to him. But the boy just continued to stare at the werewolf, clutching the large leather-bound tome tightly to his chest. Fenrir Greyback, in his lupine form, howled. From behind the door and further away in the house Cecilia heard footsteps. Remus's father coming to protect him. But it would all be too late. Too late to save him from being bitten. Cecilia launched herself at the werewolf. Not that it was ever going to do that much good, but it so happened to be just at the moment when the creature decided to attack. It had not banked on a force winding it in the stomach as it went for its spray, and Cecilia's blow caused both of them to fall towards the window. The werewolf howled again out of anger now rather than to cause fear in its victim, and it thrashed around on its back as its assailant found herself somersaulting out of the bedroom window and into the dark and stormy dash. Cecilia looked up and saw another memory cloud. For a good few minutes she watched it swirl as she came to terms with what she had just seen and what she had just done. Had that really been her Remus? And had she really attacked Fenrir Greyback? Had it been enough to prevent him from biting him? She barely had time to think when she felt herself sinking. This memory felt like thick blancmange, like custard, and Cecilia began to writhe in it, which did not do anything at all to help her other than to make her sink faster. She held her breath as her face approached the misty mass and waited for the thing to either reveal another memory here or otherwise suffocate her as it dragged her beneath. It didn't take long before the former happened, and Cecilia was amazed to find that the inside of this memory was now the consistency of cool dense air, of the same ilk as the atmosphere you find on a cold day. Cecilia was staring down into a Hogwarts classroom. It looked to be the potions classroom from the look of the shelves stacked to one side containing all manner of eyes of newt. The fireplace was the same too, a wide, undulating spray of marble. There was no one in the room and nothing else from which she could discern anything of note. Just as she considered that whatever was compelling her to select memories for her had got it wrong, Cecilia watched the door open, one which, she noticed, had not changed in the intervening period between then and now. It certainly reverberated in the same way that it had done less than 6 months before, when Cecilia had stormed out of the classroom on more than one occasion through her frustration with Snape. This time the young wizard waited for it to vibrate to silence before locking it magically with a short sharp spell. If this didn't have her attention immediately, then the fact that the wizard strutted over to the teacher's desk at the back of the classroom, lazily leafing through the contents of the pots and parchments, definitely did. Cecilia felt a teacherly urge to scold this young whippersnapper for his audacity. "Tom!" A muffled voice called the name of the student through the door, the sound muffled by the thick wood of the door. Cecilia looked at it before staring back at the student, who had not been alerted to the call from beyond the door and continued to leaf through some more parchments that he had pulled out from the desk drawer. "Tom! Go away, I'm working." That seemed to work, for his name was not shouted through the door again, and Cecilia watched the young wizard casually leaf through a book which he had found on the floor next to the desk. "Ah!" The student yelled in frustration at the book after he had looked through it, throwing it violently towards the classroom door and, in its downward trajectory, using his wand, cast a few balls of sparks at it, incinerating it to ash, which drifted down like tiny feathers onto the flagstones. Cecilia felt a bolt of annoyance at the destruction of knowledge and stared angrily at the student as he began to pace round the classroom seemingly at random, pulling other books from the shelf and tossing them onto the floor. Cecilia allowed herself to drop into the memory. Above her the tendril would be able to be reached if she were to just climb onto the desk, and she put to the back of her mind her previous interactions with the content of the cloudy reminiscence. Halfway down though, Cecilia stopped, holding the tendril between her knees as the wizard called Tom brought over his books to the teacher's desk and threw them unceremoniously onto the thick oak top. Huff and curse. Hog teeth. Holy Island leeches. Cecilia waited, suspended above the student who was reading aloud from the book, and crinkled up her nose and eyes so she could see what was on the page. Though she couldn't read the small text that Tom was, she could however read the title of the book that was inscribed in clear quill pen by the author. She read it again, just to be sure. Homeric Trojan Beetles. Who's Law. Hoopla Charm. Authorized all magic. The student below her seemed oblivious to Cecilia reading the book over her shoulder, and he continued to read aloud what seemed to be titles of spells within the book as he searched for something. Hopkirkbead. Hoppers. Both Cecilia and the student Tom seemed to notice the burn mark in the page at the same time. Cecilia bit her lip to stop her from calling out, but it didn't matter because Tom cursed loudly at the sight. Merlin's ass. This book was cast onto the floor in the student's rage, but, unlike the hapless book earlier, it was not incinerated. Instead, Tom picked it back up as it sparked a little under his hand as he thrust it onto the desk again. Flicking back to the pages he had been looking through moments before, Tom ran through his list again before coming upon this section, seemingly burned through. Biblion Flamore, whispered Cecilia under her breath, and she recalled a time when Remus had told her that it had been discovered during the 1980s. Before this, it was always assumed such destruction had been caused wantonly. I will find you. Raising his wand aloft, Tom angled it towards the bookshelf. Accio Horcrux. For a moment, Cecilia was taken aback as she watched a shelf of books explode their contents onto the floor and a thin parchment unravel itself, zooming in the direction of the outstretched wand. Horcrux. Someone was searching for a spell for a Horcrux. There was only one person that could be. Slughorn, I knew you'd never destroy it. Cecilia tried to dip lower so she could read the A4-sized parchment that Tom, Cecilia could only assume Riddle, had in his hand. Now, all I have to do is dash. Tom Riddle. Cecilia realized that she had said his name out loud. The hope that in this memory she was merely a bystander evaporated before her as the young wizard who would one day become the most terrible, feared wizard, looked at her. "Who are you?" Cecilia paused. Her will to tell him the truth began to turn into a reality as her name traveled up through her throat. She swallowed defensively and forced a smile. "A new teacher to the school?" "Yes." He continued to stare at her. Cecilia Frobisher, suspended by a tendril above him, seemingly hanging above him in the potions classroom. The headmaster never mentioned it. Professor Dumbledore only made the appointment today. It was here that Cecilia realized she had slipped up. As Tom Riddle frowned at her a little, she repeated the name of the headmaster of Hogwarts during this student stay. She had even spoken to Professor Dippet, and he had provided her with valuable information towards her research into the Universal Link. "You're no teacher?" "No." Cecilia felt herself grip the tendril a little tighter. She would need it, she was sure, to leave this memory very soon. "You're an angel." She tried not to laugh at Tom Riddle, the student below her who had searched for one of the most potent spells known and used it in a way no wizard had done before. "An angel?" Cecilia repeated. "You believe me to be an dash." Cecilia. "We're here." "Yes, an angel. I read the old magic." Tom continued to stare at her as she glanced past the young wizard, trying to work out where the words in her mind had come from. "And that means that?" "I never believed it." The young Riddle began to pace round Cecilia. "That if I read the old magic that an angel would appear. It sounds like a story, something from mythology." "It certainly does," thought Cecilia. "But, you are? What are you looking for in my book?" The reality that Tom Riddle was buying into seemed to be an easy mantle to wear. He glanced at her uncertainly for a moment before proceeding to leaf through the book. "So you admit it," he continued. "You are an angel." Cecilia nodded, and descended a little lower. "What is it you want from life, Tom?" She watched as he jerked his head on hearing his name, staring at her intently. "Power. And never to die. And my spell will help you, will it?" Cecilia. "Look for us." "Of course. What I intend to do will bring me everything I desire. It will bring me immortality. It will bring me overwhelming supremacy. Cecilia. She looked over her shoulder, the words sounding as if they were coming from above her, and she stared back at the grey fluffiness which encapsulated the memory, but her attention was brought back to what Tom Riddle was doing in the memory which had caused the room to illuminate like a flash of lightning. Once the smoke from the epicenter of the spell had cleared, Cecilia gasped in horror at the agonized, open-mouthed expression on the young student's face. Cecilia. Find me. As Cecilia wondered what to do next, above her another tendril dropped down and, without climbing herself, she was pulled up, towards the ceiling of the potions classroom in the cloud above. Above, towards where she could hear the voices calling her more clearly now. And once she was through the interface between inner memory and outer, she heard her name, clear and strong over her shoulder. Cecilia. Can you hear me? Tim. That was Tim's voice. She looked around her in search of her dead husband, but all that was there, from the few feet before her to as far as she could see, were memory clouds, of different shapes and sizes. Tim? We can be happy again. Come here. The voice was definitely coming from before her, and, as she looked on, a memory cloud sidled into view. From its vicinity she heard Tim's voice again. We can be happy again. Cecilia stepped forward, stepping onto nothing and swinging herself forward with the tendril. Tim had called her. She obviously needed to go the next. Tim needed her. So she needed him. As she swung nearer to the memory, she let go of the tendril and looked down, waiting to see her husband again, impeded by Death Eaters through exposure on Scawfell Pike and dying consequentially from pneumonia. But, while she did see the face of Tim Frobisher again, it was all too fleeting, and she fell through another memory that seemed to be sandwiched to the bottom of the memory, and then another, all passing before her eyes all too quickly. My best friend. It's me, Libby. A tendril, small but visible, peeked over the edge of a subsequent memory, and Cecilia allowed herself to dwell in a memory that contained something of her murdered, pregnant friend. The voice reverberated in her mind and she saw her face, but Libby could not see Cecilia, hanging on to the tendril adjacent to her, waving and calling. "Come back to us. Just let go. And we can go home." This time her friend seemed to see Cecilia but did not speak the words. Instead they appeared in her mind as they had done before, and a strong feeling in her mind told her that she must hang on to the tendril and allow these memories to pass her by. "Fight it," she told herself. "These are not real. They are going to make you forget your purpose here." The tendril took her further down, heart-cripplingly fast away from her friend, and she flicked through another couple of cloud memories before slowing as she heard the name she was always called by her best friend when she was at school. Duracell. Others tried it, but only Libby could get away with it. Below her she saw her school, and her friend, in blazer and tie, skirt rolled up at the waistband to half-thigh length and crimped hair. It was her old life. That was the path she could take. Back at school. With her friend. Before this happened,